Well, good evening again, everyone. Feels a little off this week. We had the holiday. I've been recording these videos on Monday. And so here I am on a Tuesday on the first day of school. If I get interrupted by a small child at the door, it's because Hayes does not start pre-K until the middle end of this month. And so he's getting some office time with me. So I've got him distracted with a movie, and hopefully that lasts. But, you know, if he interrupts, y'all just get to see his cute face for a few minutes and probably listen to him whine about something, and then he'll be on his way and we'll be able to continue on. We are continuing on with our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We spent the last several weeks working our way through the Sermon on the Mount, but because it is so much the heart of Matthew's Gospel and such a loved section of Scripture, I thought it was important that we take our time and work through some of its deeper implications that we often either choose to ignore or rush through or qualify. But Jesus does a lot of unqualified teaching. He doesn't provide a lot of easy outs for some of the harder things he says. And we like hard teachings to come with qualifications or restrictions or limits, but he lets his first audience and us as readers know that discipleship matters, that discipleship is costly, that discipleship requires a lot from you. It requires a change of everything from you. And we're actually kind of continuing in that. The Sermon on the Mount really sets the table for what comes next in Matthew's Gospel. So you'll notice a few different things on the board behind me. Obviously, what's over here has a picture right there. Maybe a little bit hard to see because of the light, but I'll give you an explanation. It ties into the couple of passages that we were looking at tonight quite well. And then I've got a quote that I'll share with you in just a minute from Henry Nouwen. So a guy with a great first name, though he spells it wrong. He uses an I instead of a Y. And then I want to do a breakdown of more than just what we're looking at tonight in Matthew 8, because reading it as a whole matters. And so by way of reminder, the inclusion of Gentiles is an important point to Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel begins with a genealogy that includes Gentiles, women. It ends with a push to go teach the Gentiles, and everything in between. Jesus is constantly transgressing some of those old lines, especially around the Gentiles, in order to help his audience. Of course, then Matthew includes it in order to help his understand that the gospel is bigger than one group, one race, one tribe, one nation, one people. That it is intended for everyone. And that's exactly where we land tonight. So I'll step this way and show what I've got written over. I feel like a weather person. Like if this was a green screen and I was pointing at stuff. Anyway, where we are in Matthew's Gospel. So Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7 is all about discipleship. That is the Sermon on the Mount. It is constant teaching about discipleship. And I think what happens as soon as it's over, Jesus comes down on the mountain and we immediately run into somebody that begins to make us ask bigger questions about the who side of discipleship. And so I think in a lot of ways, Matthew chapter 8, and continuing on past that, but 8 specifically here, starts answering the question, who can be a disciple? And it does so with much wider parameters than we usually see in the time period in which Jesus lived and taught, especially with the traditional Jewish community. So, who can be a disciple? And then the verses that follow, can someone who is ritually impure, unclean, can they be a disciple? Can a Gentile be a disciple? Can a woman be a disciple? Can those who doubt or fear be disciples? Can a demon-possessed Gentile, which is like a culmination of all of them, can they be a disciple? Where are the lines? And that's where I want to step this way and show off this picture, which if you've been in if you've listened to any of my Sunday sermons, you've heard me reference it very likely at some point or another. And so I'm actually going to pull it down in order to help with the lighting, because I think it does a good job of illustrating what we are about to play witness to. As you can see, a group of people using their pencils to draw lines that separate themselves from others. And you see Jesus working his way through that with an eraser. A lot of what Jesus did as he taught and functioned in his world was to show people that some of those lines, some of those preconceived notions and expectations didn't really line up with what God wanted, what God was doing. And in fact, that's why I chose the quote that I chose today for class from Henry Nouwen. He writes, "Our preoccupations prevent our having new experiences and keep us hanging on to the familiar ways. It often seems we prefer a bad certainty to a good uncertainty. Our preoccupations help us to maintain the personal world we have created over the years and block the way to change." What he points out is our preoccupations, our previous commitments, the world in which we have decided, the way of life that is often embedded in us. We don't really choose it. It just kind of chooses us based on where we're born and where we're raised and who our parents are. Those kind of ingrained things that show up in our lives all shape us a specific way, but that's not necessarily a positive thing. Wherein we could look at Jesus' audience that we're about to talk about for the next few chapters and say that they have an ingrained and embedded theology of preoccupation or a concept of what civic structure should be that prevents them from playing witness to what God is doing. And Jesus is about to challenge that in these three sets of healings that we are going to look at today. Actually, I think for today, I'm just going to look at two of them because it really is a lot to cover, and I don't want to venture into like the 40-minute territory here. So, Jesus has just finished, in the way that Matthew tells the story, the Sermon on the Mount. There's a large crowd that has heard him wrap up and is following him. Matthew chapter 8 begins this way. Large crowds followed Jesus as he came down the mountainside. Suddenly, a man with leprosy approached him and knelt before him. "Lord," the man said, "if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean." Jesus reached out and touched him. "I am willing," he said, "be healed." And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Then Jesus said to him, "Don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses to those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been clean." Just for the sake of historic information, a few comments on leprosy. Nowadays, this is what we understand, we call it Hansen's disease. In the ancient world, of course, they didn't have the ability to study, like on a microscopic scale, exactly what different diseases and conditions are. So what they coined or termed leprosy was actually a much wider range of things than the Hansen's disease of today. So psoriasis, some rashes, anything along those lines that caused discoloration and peeling or death of the skin could very quickly have you on the outside looking in of the community. And people with leprosy were not allowed a space in the community. There are various writings that exist in this, including some in the Old Testament, others from different Jewish writings that aren't in the Bible but come from very much the same time period, where if you have leprosy, you are to live outside the community. You're cut off from contact from friends and family and what you knew. And in fact, this man who approaches Jesus really messes up, because what he should be yelling out as he walks around, if he's out in a public space walking, is "unclean, unclean," so people have plenty of heads up to get out of the way. The other side of this coin is that to touch someone who has leprosy, there's some health risk there, especially in the ancient world without a huge knowledge of how diseases are shared. I think one of the reasons that rules like this existed in the community was to keep people healthy and keep the community functional and well and alive. But you couldn't have contact with. You couldn't touch this person. And one of the things that we don't do a good job of pointing out, I've heard it mentioned a couple of times out of this verse, is it's not necessarily the healing that is the most profound part of this passage to the earliest audience. Especially around Jesus, people who were aware of Jesus or affiliated with Jesus understood that he could work some powerful healings. This is par for the course. This man runs up with the confidence that Jesus can do it. His only question is whether or not Jesus will. That's not surprising. The surprising part of this passage is that before the man is ever healed, Jesus reaches out and touches him. That is written that way for a specific reason. This is very obviously a clear and defined line that existed in the Jewish community that Jesus was in, and Jesus intentionally transgresses it, and Matthew makes sure that we understand that that's the order in which things happened. Jesus reached out and touched him, and then speaks words of healing to him. I am willing, be healed, and instantly the leprosy disappeared. Now, Jesus is not trying to blow all Jewish traditions out of the water. He tells the man to go offer sacrifices to show himself to the authorities, to prove that he is now clean and able to be a part of the community again. Like, all of that is still very much part of the tradition. But some of the lines that have kept people out are fading away. So, step this way. Can somebody who is unclean be a disciple? Well, this man acts in faith in a way that disciples don't always do. And so the answer is yes. And then we move on to the next passage for today. When Jesus returned to Capernaum, continuing on verse 5, a Roman officer came and pleaded with him. And we'll just pause right there for a second. This is a loaded and potentially confrontational interaction. Like, starting with that as a foundation for understanding this passage and what goes with it. Jesus is surrounded by other people. Those other people are Jewish, and those other Jewish people are not fans of Roman centurions, Roman soldiers, Roman officers, the Roman military, or any non-Jewish person in general. This is taking place like in the land of Judea. This is traditional Jewish homeland, but it's now been under Roman control for like 100 years. And the Jewish populace is not, ecstatic about that. There have been many revolts that have taken place along the way. There have been atrocities committed by Roman soldiers against Jewish people. There have been massacres of Roman soldiers by Jewish zealots, guerrilla warriors. Like, I think we read these passages so flat sometimes, but I cannot understate how much this is a person who has no place in this community by the standards that existed in Jesus' day. You do not see Roman soldiers being all buddy-buddy with Jewish civilians. It's just not a thing that happens. And yet, in this moment, you have what I can only describe as a desperate centurion. Probably stationed there in Capernaum, probably one of the ones in charge of the military force who's there. He's described as a centurion, an officer, a commander of a group of people. I don't know how large the force was in Capernaum at this time. Probably not massive. This may very well be one of the most important military, most important Roman figures in the town at this point. And we have no idea and get no story about what he knows about Jesus. It's not there. We don't get the idea that he's a proselyte, a convert to Judaism. He's not described in our initial introduction here as a God-fearer. We get none of that. All we know is that he seems to have some confidence that Jesus can do something about this situation. And depending on which manuscript you read, it's either his servant or his son, and I don't know which translations pick what, and who it is not overly important, though some people have tried to make it so over the years. All that really matters for Matthew's audience and for us reading this story is that he's a Gentile and a Roman officer at that. So the question, can he be a disciple, seems to have an obvious answer. No, of course he can't. He has no place in the community. Nobody would want him in the community. Why would you even bother? They have their own system. They're a part of the problem, not a part of the solution. Let's just keep them all at arm's length. But this one comes and pleads with Jesus, addresses him with an honorific title of Lord, and it says, "My young servant lies in bed, paralyzed and in terrible pain." And then verse 7 is an interesting one, because some translate it as a statement and some translate it as a question. The question is better. Remember, I've mentioned this before, but like Greek manuscripts don't have punctuation. So there's not like a question mark or a period that identifies what's going on here. We're kind of left to context to guess. And I think what happens is that Jesus asks this Gentile Roman officer in front of him, "Should I come to your home to heal him?" What I don't know is if Jesus is trying to step away from the man, which is something he does, like with the woman who comes begging to be healed, who's a Gentile in another portion of the gospel. Or if Jesus is asking, "Oh, do you want me to come with you?" But the question is there, and the man answers in an unexpected way. Jesus said in mine translation of 7, it makes it a statement. But again, I don't think that's right. Jesus asked, "Should I come and heal him?" Verse 8, the officer said, "Lord, I am not worthy to have you come into my home. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say go and they go, or come and they come. And if I tell my slaves do this, they do it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and turning to those who were following him, he said, "I tell you the truth, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel." Realizing that he's making that statement to a group of Israelites, Jewish people, who are following him, that is in many ways a challenge, where Jesus is essentially saying, "Hey, you see this Roman centurion that you guys all despise and detest and are very uncomfortable with the fact that he's here in front of me asking me for this, and the vast majority of you would probably be happiest if I said, 'Oh, no, your servant's dead, and so are you.' Yeah, that guy is showing you what genuine faith looks like." And after that, Jesus follows it up with a loaded statement, where he says in verse 11, "And I tell you this, truly I tell you, that many Gentiles will come from all over the world, from east and west, and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. But many Israelites, those for whom the kingdom was prepared, will be thrown to the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Okay, so where we started tonight, with a reminder that Gentiles and the inclusion of Gentiles is central to Matthew's message. And if you go back to the early weeks, we talked about how very likely one of the challenges in Matthew's community is what to do and how to form a community where there's divisions between Jewish believers in Jesus and Jewish believers who don't believe in Jesus, and how they function in the synagogue, and whether or not they can stay in the synagogue, and what do you do with these Gentile believers. And so Matthew shares this story of the healing of this centurion's son servant, and then shares this statement that basically it's a statement like this that nearly gets him killed in his hometown of Nazareth in the Gospel of Mark, if I'm remembering correctly. Where the idea of the inclusion of Gentiles is just a step too far. And here, Jesus says, hey, you remember those really important people in our story, the ones we venerate and know as great prophets and leaders of the people, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? Yeah, they're going to be sharing table fellowship with Gentiles. And this image of the great banquet is one that's not restricted to just Jewish or Christian understandings. Like, this is a cultural concept where in ancient Near Eastern culture in general. And the sharing of table fellowship, the sharing of a meal, of a great banquet together, is an image that shows close kinship and kindred. It's one of solidarity, one that reveals close relationship. And Jesus puts Abraham and Isaac and Jacob at the table, sharing a meal in close relationship and fellowship with this Roman officer. I'm shocked the next story that shows up is not the crowd in Capernaum trying to kill Jesus. I am amazed that there is not like 30 verses on the grumbling of people because of it, because that's the level of discomfort and severity Jesus' statement carries. And yet, again, Jesus is answering questions here. Who can be a disciple? Can the unclean be a disciple? Can the Gentile be a disciple? And then the next story, which I will go ahead and jump to because I have time, of one more person. There in Capernaum, the next question, can a woman be a disciple? Which sounds like an odd question in our modern context, but remembering that the ancient world was very different. Have you noticed we don't have stories of like Pharisees named Cynthia in the New Testament who are coming up to challenge Jesus? Like, there's a very patriarchal and hierarchical society, and depending on where you were, especially in that ancient world, like in some places women aren't even allowed out of the house without their husbands. It's fairly true in Greek societies. I know I've talked about that a little bit before. And so here's another question. How are you going to respond to Jesus? And you'll notice that that's essentially what happens in these stories. Jesus comes off the Sermon on the Mount talking about discipleship, and you have people responding. Now, we get those responses in the form of miracle stories, people in need of something going to Jesus, but that's programmatic, that's intentional. It's signaling some bigger thing. So they're going to Jesus and they're receiving what they need from him, and then some. And Jesus is letting his audience know, no, these people are in. You don't draw lines to keep them out. Verse 14 of chapter 8, when Jesus arrived at Peter's house, Peter's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a high fever. But when Jesus touched her hand, the fever left her. Then she got up and prepared a meal for him. That evening, many demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus. He cast out the evil spirits with a simple command and healed all the sick. This is fulfilled in the words of the Lord through the prophet Isaiah, who said, he took our sicknesses and removed our diseases. So for tonight, that's where we are going to stop. I want to spend a good portion of time with the next three stories. Just as a teaser, next week, we start with the first two people that don't receive like immediate encouragement to follow. And they are people who you would think would be insiders. One who is described as a disciple already, and another who is described as a teacher of religious law. And they are the only two people in these set of stories asking questions about who can be a disciple that are not immediately celebrated, that are not held up as models, that are not championed for their faith. And I think that's an intentional reminder that our preoccupations are sometimes wrong. That our expectations and understandings of how things are and how things should be are misguided. Now, of course, like every generation that's come before us, we tend to think that we're the best ever and that we have all of the answers right and that we know more than those who have come before. And in some avenues, we may have more information or more knowledge, but that doesn't mean that we have all of the information or all of the knowledge, aren't missing something. Jesus, in many ways, is constantly reminding his audience that there are things that they're missing, they need to pay better attention to. So that's where we will pick up next week. Glad that you joined us this evening. I'm glad this format is working for you. I really, really enjoy being able to record, being able to write stuff on the board behind me, and be able to share some stuff with you that way. All right, glad that you were with us. We'll be back at it again next week with the rest of Chapter 8. Y'all have a good one.